afternoon to our conference on attention and attunement. I think most of you know that I'm David Freedberg, and I've been director of the Academy for a while. It's great to see such a large audience. I'm going to go back, if I may, in the past, because I think some of you, but perhaps not many of you, I think Jackie, one of our speakers today, Jackie Gottlieb, may remember that we had a conference exactly in March, at the end of March 2008, entitled Vision, Attention, and Emotion. And we had an extraordinary roster of the then experts on attention. It was almost as well attended as this afternoon, probably about the same, actually. And they had some notables in the field: John Reynolds, James Bisley, Earl Miller, our own Daniel Salzman, Steve Yantis, alas now deceased, Jeremy Wolf, Marlene Berman, Liz Phelps from NYU. This was a star-studded group of experts on attention. And actually, Dan Kahneman, also recently deceased, showed up along with Anne Treisman, who was one of the pioneers in the study of attention. So the bar is high for this afternoon, but fortunately it's a totally different competition, because I think attention is going in a different direction today. So I'm really looking forward, as I hope you are, to hear our talented group of 3 speakers this afternoon. Now, I want to tell you how we got here. We didn't get here via attention. I've always been interested in attention myself. I think it's one of the central problems of our lives. Those of you who are humanists may know that Walter Benjamin, who no humanists can fail to cite in these times, was very interested in the question of attention, and in fact, I'm looking at you, Jackie, again, in the question of distraction. I think he thought higher of distraction than of attention, but that's another discussion that we might have on another occasion. And that conference was a great success. That first conference didn't talk about Benjamin, and today's conference will not deal with many of the issues that we dealt with in 2008. And I'm very happy about that. I was going to tell you how it came about. It came about because we have a very distinguished visitor as a fellow of the Italian Academy, Raphael Rosenberg, who came to us as now the world's leading expert on eye tracking devices. Most neuroscientists now use eye trackers in one or another stage of their experiments, most cognitive neuroscientists involved with visual things. But Raphael has been unique in attaching this to the question of artistic attention to the objects of art. And having Raphael here happened to coincide with the visit of Wayne Wu, who is our second speaker this evening. I'm not following the order of your listing, but Wayne was here as well, and it turned out that he also is an expert on attention. In fact, we are waiting anxiously for his new book on the subject of attention and attunement. So, and I return to Wayne in a moment. So Wayne, who is a philosopher and a neuroscientist, was able to go to battle both collaboratively and dialectically, let's put it that way, over the matter of attention and saccadic eye movements and fixations. So we really had something interesting going, and the person who, needless to say, came in and took an interest in all of this, and who really, I think, guided much of their researches, was our dear colleague and a dear friend of many years, Jackie Gottlieb, who is now at Zuckerman, has always been at Columbia as far as I can remember. And Jackie injected some solid neuroscience as well as the kind of imaginative speculation on the basis of extraordinarily empirical precise empirical experiments for which she is well known. So imagination joined with precision, art history joined with philosophy, and neuroscience was the binding factor. So I'm really happy to see that we have a large audience this afternoon. I just want to say something. Welcome to all of you. I hope this delivers some interesting goods. Now let me introduce. I'm going to introduce all three speakers. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, which is in fact inverted from the order in which they will speak. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, and I will introduce them, all three of them at once. Therefore, I'll stay up here for a while, and then I'll withdraw from the fray until our discussion at the end, in which I hope you will all be preparing sharp questions coming from any direction you would like to choose. So maybe I'll withdraw from the whole matter in the end. I can't guarantee that, however. So our first, in alphabetical order, our first speaker today will be Jackie Gottlieb, who is professor of neuroscience at the ZMBBI, as we call it, the Zuckerman Mind, Brain and Behavior Institute, here at Columbia. And in your program notes, you will see that she is recorded as being a great expert on attention, but the real fact is, I think, that she extends much more widely than just attention. I think, of course, the question of how much attention you pay to the object that you're attending to and not to other things is one of the mysteries we will be trying to resolve today. But not surprisingly, she really is involved in the study of the brain's higher cognitive functions, including, obviously, attention comes into it, decision-making, memory, and attention. She's interested in how the brain gathers the evidence it needs and ignores what it doesn't during everyday tasks and during special states such as, so the art historians will be pleased here, such as curiosity. Curiosity has become a subject of much interest in the humanities. I actually happen to think it's an overrated topic, but Jackie can argue with me about this in private, perhaps, because it may not, well, it obviously relates to attention. On va voir, as we say. Her research does offer insight into disorders as well that involve deficits of attention, such as attention deficit disorder, one of the great problems of our time, distraction, depression, and drug addiction. And you can see all her honors on your program notes, but I just want to mention, as I will do with the others, some articles or some pieces of research which they have each written, which seem to me really interesting and give one a sense of where their interests really lie. So there is a recent article from 2016 on spatial and non-spatial aspects of visual attention and the interactive cognitive mechanisms and their neural underpinnings in these spatial aspects of attention. Then moving towards her interest in curiosity. I mean, you read these titles and you realize how relevant the matter of attention is when there's another article entitled, The Worst Thing an Introducer Can Do. I thought I'd switched it off. So that'd be a reminder to all of you to switch off your phones. So we've got novelty enhances visual salience independently of reward. We like that topic just by the sound of it. Information seeking, curiosity, and attention, computational. So that's information seeking. This is one of Jackie's big things. So information seeking as an aim of attention, and curiosity she brings in there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, what the opposite of attention, we think, there's an interesting piece earlier on distinct neural mechanisms of distractor suppression. So, attention is also a matter of distractor suppression, and she talks about the frontal and parietal lobe operations involved in that. So that should be enough to pique your interest in Jackie, those of you who don't know, but she couldn't be more pertinent to today's discussions. Then we come to Raphael himself, Raphael Rosenberg, who is professor of art history at the University of Vienna, which I discover is now, I think, the second largest, or is it the largest university in Europe? It's either the Sapienza in Rome, which has 100,000 students, and I think Vienna has something almost around 100,000 students, Raphael. So these are big operations, and they are at the center, at least, of their brain operations. So Raphael, he began as a regular art historian, and there's still very few kosher art historians, so to speak, who deal with cognitive neuroscience. It's become fashionable in the field known as neuroaesthetics, but it's certainly not fashionable among serious art historians. So he began as a serious art historian, writing about the discovery of abstraction, and then just before that, he wrote a remarkable book on descriptions and drawings after the sculptures of Michelangelo. So this, in a way, is a topic which may not excite you, copies after Michelangelo, but it obviously has to deal with the way people perceive the objects before them and the adaptations they make. And I think it's actually from that slightly improbable start that Raphael became interested in eye tracking. And so he's been working. He's also written about fascist architecture in Germany, and a whole series of articles and collaborative works on Hitler's architecture. A slightly depressing subject, I think, but probably there are lessons. I'm sure there are lessons to be learned from those. But he swiftly, as I say, became involved in the question of eye tracking. I'm sure he'll tell you perhaps how that came about. But this was, maybe it was because he wrote an article on the anti-mimetic aesthetic of marbling. Anyone who walks into our entrance halls notice the rather poor Italian marble with the veins that attract the eye that go up and down. If you go in the where does your eye jump to? What are the saliences and what are the fixation points when you look at marbling? Perhaps that was one of the reasons you got round to, this is speculation, Raphael, got round to eye tracking. He also wrote some books. I can't resist putting this in some books on the work of a remarkable art historian from before the war and slightly afterwards, Julius von Schlosser, who really collected all the writings about Western art, first in the Middle Ages and then in the Renaissance. And it's a fundamental reference work, and Schlosser himself was a remarkable figure. But he then got on to the question of eye tracking. He worked in collaboration with cognitive neuroscientists and psychologists in Vienna, as he continues to do. So there are the articles that you would expect on does pictorial composition guide the eye. He looks at the time-based evaluation changes in top-down versus bottom-up assessment in aesthetic judgment. So you could also see there how top-down influences may modulate one's responses to one's visual responses to objects before one, and so the articles go on, like how you respond to rough or smooth objects, how you respond to the sense of temperature when you look at those objects. And then I like one of the earlier articles, but I hadn't noticed this, no, it's recent, 2019. There's an article which deals with one of my bêtes noires. Most people who have worked about neuroaesthetics have always honed in on the need for symmetry in judgments on beauty. And this seems to be accepted. I think there are all kinds of problems with this notion that symmetry is a universal law of beauty, and needless to say, Raphael has written an article reproving that very notion. So we have one of the great experts both on aesthetics, on the history of art, and on eye tracking, on which he has done pioneering work. And finally, in my alphabetical sequence, I want to talk about Wayne Wu, who you can see that his associate, well, actually his biography doesn't say that, his associate professor of the Philosophy and Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon. We were happy to have him here. He wrote a most interesting proposal for his research here. He was a live wire as a fellow, and he has published before on agency, consciousness, these broad concepts, as well as perception and, above all, attention. He already wrote a book published by Routledge in 2014 on attention, and now we have this recent book, Movements of the Mind, which I recommend you all to read. Wayne is insistent, that attention, who was the sort of dominating definer of detention at the beginning of all of this, the predictable figure of William James, and even James wrote, "Everyone knows what attention is." We may well wonder about that. He said, "It's the taking possession in clear and vivid form, one of several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought." Seems straightforward enough. I'd be happy just to settle on that, but I think we're going to have some refinement as we move forward. And actually, in a recent article on attention, which Wayne has produced, entitled "We Know What Attention Is!" So you read this article, we know what attention is, and he concludes, I hope he's going to refine this or be a bit self-critical, he concludes, a subject's attention to T is the subject's selection of T to perform a task. Well, that's a novel idea, but it's clear enough. I'm sure he will offer us much refinement in that order, and I also want here now just to remind you of some of his writings. There was an article a while back or actually quite recently, "Is Vision for Action Unconscious?" So it touches there's a lot of discussion about vision for action ever since Milner and Goodale, perhaps not even before. So that's an article which raises the question of consciousness or not of vision for action. He also has written an article which interests me greatly called "Automaticity, Control and Attention in Skill." The question of automaticity is one that has never been, and how to talk about automatic responses has never been properly resolved. That's another offering from Wayne, which needs attention. In the Stanford Encyclopedia, he's also written a great piece on the neuroscience of consciousness. If ever there were an encyclopedia article which needed the kind of survey which Wayne gives it in a few words. I mean, unconsciousness is the biggest topic of consciousness, is the biggest topic one can imagine. It's a hot topic. I was delighted that one of our fellows here, Gian Domenico Ianetti, was rather skeptical about the problem in the first place of consciousness, which that skepticism I share as well. But there are those people who think that we're going to resolve one day the problem of consciousness. He wrote articles about the connection between attention and perception, an obvious kind of topic which really needs the attention that he has devoted to it. He's also been interested in the question of automaticity and agency, so there's a wonderful piece entitled "The Case for Zombie Agency." Do zombies have agency? And then, of course, the inevitable question of whether intention penetrates vision. And so it goes on. I mean, he's been involved in working on psychiatry, attention as selection for action, same subject is returned to what is conscious attention, and so on. So I'm going to stop there. These are immensely prolific authors who have written engagingly and abundantly on the topic of attention and attunement. Attunement is, you will learn more about this at least from Wayne as we move forward in this afternoon's proceedings. So now I'm going to stop talking and turn the stage over to the first of our speakers, who will be Jackie Gottlieb. Jackie? Wayne, I forgot. Sorry, yes, exactly. We're inverting the order. Wayne, good. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. I know it's a beautiful day outside. I want to thank David and Barbara Faeta, the directors of the Italian Academy, for hosting this event in this beautiful space, and the staff for putting it together. I want to introduce you to this idea of attunement, And attunement just really simply just means you're being ready to, or inclined to, or being prepared to pay attention. And to get there, you have to acquire a certain set of biases, and the biases allow you to be skilled or less skilled in attention. So those are the ideas that I'm going to bring forward. I'm going to do it in terms of a philosophical perspective. And the idea of the philosophical perspective is to look at how things in the world are connected together by looking at how the concepts are connected together. So the three big ideas to begin with will be, I'm going to give you an answer to the question, what is attention? And I need that answer to explain to you what attunement is. It's a really common phenomenon that I think you'll recognize once we get through the talk. And then I'm going to put these two things together in a big picture of human agency, what it is to be a human agent. And in that picture, we need this idea of a bias. A bias is not a negative thing, it's a very general thing that I'll describe to you. And then I'll talk about how we learn to be better attuned in a way that we can be skillful attenders. Okay. Now, it might surprise some of you that in the sciences, there's actually quite a lot of skepticism going back over a century. So people say that there's no such thing as attention. No one knows what attention is. These are actually two excellent articles, but you can see the skepticism. In an article that I wrote, actually finished here at the Academy when I was a fellow in the fall, I pushed back and I said, of course we know what attention is, and please note the exclamation mark. And all I'm doing there, as David mentioned, is channeling something that William James expressed over a century ago, when he said that everyone knows what attention is. Now here, he's not being a theorist. He's just giving voice to what we all know. And here's what he says, and I think you'll recognize the phenomenon as you experience it. When you attend to something, your mind takes possession of that thing among other things that you perceive or think about. So I want you to note that there's both perceptual attention and attention in thought. And you do that to withdraw from the other stuff, the distractors, so you can deal effectively with what you select, okay? So I can distill that in this idea that the purpose of attention is for you to select things in thought or the world so you can act on them, so you can respond to them. This is sometimes called selection for action. And I'm going to distill this further into a conditional, which allows us to run some arguments later, okay? So formally, and I'll get to an example in a second, if you, the subject S, mentally takes possession of something in order to deal with, then you're attending to that thing. That's what attention is, okay? I'll give you an example. Right now you're listening to my words. Thank you very much. So you're auditorily selecting my voice, my words, in order to understand what I'm saying or to follow and track my thoughts. And in doing so, you are auditorily attending. You're listening to me. Okay? So that's just one example of how it goes. Now, I want to think about that example in the context of our engagement with the world, including our engagement with art. And to do this, I just want to give you a little bit of art. So here's a painting by Ilya Repin. You can just have a look. Now, if you were to observe the person next to you as they were looking at this painting, what you would see is that their eyes are jumping in what are called saccadic movements. These are ballistic movements of the eye. Let's say you make them about 1 to 3 times a second. Okay? So the reason I'm putting this painting up is that, in fact, it was used by the Soviet scientist Alfred Yarbus in terms of his studies of understanding eye movements and attention. And he developed some of the first technology to track eye movements. Now, how did he study attention in this context? I'm going to jump back to this idea that I pulled out of our common conception of attention, and I'm giving you the visual form. And what Yarbus, like many experimenters, do is that they take visual selection here, and they modulate your selection by giving you instructions, by giving you tasks to perform in the laboratory that we can measure. Okay? So just take that idea on board and understand that this is the way that Yarbus is going to manipulate his subject's attention. And he did it with that painting. You're seeing a single subject, and these little lines here are the scan paths that you were making yourself just 5 minutes ago. Okay? And so he's looking at how the eye moves. And once I tell you the 3 tasks, I think it'll just be really clear why the eye moves as it does. Okay? So in panel B, the task is remember the clothes worn by the subjects in the painting. Panel C is remember the objects, their identity and locations. And panel D is to estimate how long that man has been away. Okay? Now, what I want you to notice, though, is that the movements make a lot of sense. You're extracting information to perform those tasks which are in your head. They're mental actions, remembering, estimating, okay? So if you're going to remember the clothes, you're going to look at the clothes. If you're going to remember the objects, you're going to look at the objects. And maybe the best way to sort of get a sense of how long this man has been away is to look at emotional expression in faces. So I hope you can see that pattern in these eye movements, right? Okay, so that is an illustration of what Yarbus did and what we do in the lab. We manipulate attention using this condition. And so this is a powerful idea because it shows the intersection point of how we as ordinary folk think about attention and how the laboratory, the experimenter, also does. Okay? It expresses a common idea. Okay, Yarbus also did a condition in which, as I asked you, he asked his subject just to look at the painting. And there's no more specific task than just having a look. Right? And now, one thing I want you to note is the striking automaticity of these movements. And what I mean by that is that each movement of the eye is not explicitly planned. Right? So they just happen. You can contrast that, if you'd like, with an intentional movement of the eye where you look at each corner of this slide, do it in a clockwise fashion while I talk. Okay? When you do that, you are aware of each movement. And indeed, I think after a few seconds, you're going to find that it's a real bore and tiresome. Right? So it's a wonderful thing that our eyes move automatically. In normal conditions, if you weren't looking at me, your eye would have moved, 180 times in a minute. And you're not aware of that. So that's what I mean by the automaticity of the movement. The second thing is that it's really clear that even though there's a general task of looking, there's a bias. Right? This person looks at faces a lot. So one question we can ask, since eye movements are a kind of attention, what we call overt visual attention, we could ask, why do the subjects fixate, point their eyes to faces so often? Why do they attend to faces? But now that attention is on the table, I want to now introduce the idea of attunement. So another question we can ask is, even before the painting appeared, all of us had this kind of visual attunement for faces. Why is that? So we need to now ask a different question. What is attunement? And again, remember I said that attunement is readiness to attend. That's why I needed to explain attention first. I want to give you a few examples that I hope are intuitive and clear. So consider the sentry, the castle sentry on the wall, who has been tasked to announce the presence of the enemy when the enemy appears. Now, one thing that's happening here on the wall is that there's a lot of visual attention by the soldier. The soldier is scanning over the valley. Right? The thing that the soldier cannot do is pay visual attention to the enemy because the enemy hasn't appeared yet. You can't attend to what's not there. What we can say, though, is that if the soldier is doing their job, they are vigilant for the enemy. They're ready to notice the enemy when the enemy appears. A lot of you ride the subway here in New York, right? So you're also vigilant in a different way. If you're a newbie like me who's only been in New York for a little while, I have to be intentionally vigilant when I get on the subway. But for many of you who've lived here for years, it's automatic. You get on the subway, you're not thinking that you need to be vigilant, but you are aware. Okay, so these are just sort of some basic examples of a kind of sensitivity that we have to sort of things in the environment that might be dangerous or notable. Here's a second example. I didn't press the button there. Here's a second example, which is inspired by this classic work of Neville Morey in 1959. It's the cocktail party effect. The cocktail party effect is that you're having a conversation with a group of individuals, and all of a sudden, somewhere in the back of the room, someone says your name. Okay? Your name is a powerful attractor of attention. It just pulls and captures your attention. But the point here is that before your name was uttered, we are all sensitive to the utterance of our names. It pulls our attention. So vigilance is not at this moment when your attention is pulled. It's your readiness to attend to your name before you hear it. Right? So I hope that gives you a kind of rough sense, intuitive sense of what vigilance is. Attunement is. Vigilance is one kind of attunement, but as we'll see, there are many other kinds as well. Okay. So how do we explain attunement? And now what I want to do is I want to pull the ideas of attention and attunement together in thinking about what we are as human agents. And to do that, I'm going to have to make a confession, which is that I have a very sweet tooth. One of my greatest pleasures in life is to have a great donut and a nice cup of coffee, okay? So here are some donuts. Now, the secret with donuts, of course, is that you should only ever eat one. And that's it. You got to stop, okay? So here are 2 donuts. Which one are you going to eat? All right? I know it's a very difficult problem. And this is actually meant to evoke an old fable by the French philosopher Jean Reardon, but in fact, the idea goes back at least to Aristotle, which is the example of the hungry donkey who finds 2 bales of hay. Now, unfortunately for this donkey, it's walked right down the middle, okay? So it's 2 bales of hay, equidistant, left and right. They look the same size, same distance. The poor donkey, it's got to pick one. Which one should it pick? There's no basis for favoring or prioritizing one over the other. And guess what? Philosophy is brutal. The donkey dies, okay? So now, this is a life and death situation. Donuts are just fun and games, right? So what I want to do now is to extrapolate from these 2 cases and give you an abstract representation of what we face all the time as human agents, animal agents. And so this is a kind of abstract diagram, but let me just walk you through it really quickly. On the left there, the inputs are just things that you perceive or think about. That's what I call mentally registering. And I've just picked 2 items. It could be many more. On the right is what you can do as a response, right? And the dotted lines indicate behaviors. You can respond to the number 1 or number 2, okay? And so the question that this poses to us all the time, moment by moment, is which of these actions should we select? All right, so as agents, this is the problem that we have to deal with. So whether you're a donkey faced with 2 bales of hay, you've got to pick one, and again, the donkey dies because it cannot solve this problem. Or if you're me, right, here are 2 donuts, okay? So I call this the selection problem, but it's a familiar problem in cognitive science. Again, these are the concrete cases. We can pull back and abstract, and indeed the problem is often much more complicated because there are often many things that you can do. And remember, we perceive and think about a rich world, so there are many, many inputs. How do we solve this problem moment by moment? Now, if we go back to the donuts, it's a very simple solution for me. I'm right-handed. I reach for the one on the right, which is to say, I have a spatial bias, okay? So that's the critical idea. To solve the donkey's problem, we need a bias, and I want to focus on internal or psychological biases. Now, I'm a philosopher. I'm going to, again, abstract away. You now recognize this particular problem, and I've added a bias here, because the bias is going to push us to go for one versus the other. Now, we don't want a bias that is in equilibrium, so to speak, right? Sort of neutral on the 2. We need a bias to settle the issue for us. And once it settles the issue, voila, there's me, a happy camper, okay? So the action here is performed because of that solid line. You reach for what you see, all right? Now, there are many different kinds of biases. A very natural one is when you make a decision. That settles the system. You act on your decision, okay? So this is just a picture now of human agency in the donut scenario, but again, you can abstract back. I want to now place all the other 2 items within this picture. I'll begin with attention. And the nice thing about James's idea is that we can basically do logic. We can just argue, because remember, it gives us a condition. What was James's condition? You are visually attending if your mind visually selects one object out of 2, withdrawing from the other one, which is now a distractor, in order to deal effectively with it. Okay, it's just very easy to find attention in this structure for human agency. When you act, attention is a central part of guiding your behavior, all right? So I'm going to pull it out. Again, this is the abstraction. This is the problem we face as agents. First thing is just to locate attunement. Attunement is shifting those inputs a little bit so you're more inclined to pay attention to X. And when X appears, you select it. And when you select it, you do it so you can deal effectively with it, as James said. Okay? So this is a bit of an abstraction, but what it does is it pulls those 3 ideas together into one big picture. So again, here's the cocktail party. Maybe we'll join ourselves downstairs and have some coffee and cookies afterwards. And all of a sudden, right, you're ready to begin with, to hear your name. This is an attunement that we all have. And then someone says your name behind you. Okay? That captures your attention. So we can diagram that in this diagram. We can note this in the diagram by saying that you hear your name, And now what do? Some of us turn our heads, right? Our attention is captured. Some of us who are savvier will keep our heads fixed on our conversant, but we will quietly and secretly hear the other conversation. Obviously, this is the polite way to do it. This is the big lesson today, be polite. Or you might turn your head, not so polite. Okay, so I hope that sort of clarifies a way of representing what it is to be a human agent. Now I want to sort of conclude by thinking a little bit about how we become attuned, because attunement is the beginning of attention. So here I want to say that what we have to do is learn to acquire the right biases. Okay. So, for example, again, abstractly, there's an object X and Y in the world, but X is in some sense important. Now, you might begin with sort of parity, like the donkey, right? These two things are equal to you in your mind. And so what you want to do is you want to learn and acquire a bias. And the goal of this bias is to shift you to make you more inclined to attend to the right things. Now, I mentioned decision, but another kind of bias is knowledge. Knowing things helps change how you're attuned to the world. And so if you acquire knowledge over time, you might learn to become more attuned to what you want to be attuned to. So this is abstract. Let me give you a concrete example. First, I want to just show you that in science, in neuroscience, we do have an idea for the visual case. One form of that idea is what's called a priority map. Right? And so this is going to be a way of representing attunement in the visual system. So this is from a figure here in 2021. So imagine you're driving and you see the road in front of you, and you can segment this into semantically interesting parts. Those of you in the know will know that these are actually saliency maps, but we can set that aside. What you're seeing here in these sort of heat maps is effectively a representation of what the visual system is doing in computing the priority of spatial locations, so that in the next shift of the eye or of attention, it's going to be dictated by the setting of priority by the brain in visual space, for visual space. Okay. These are four different algorithms that attempt to capture that priority. They give you different answers. The important point here is that this is a representation of the brain setting spatial attunement, so that the hot areas are sort of high priority areas, and so the eye might move to those areas. Okay? So this is just to kind of point to something that I think maybe might connect to Jackie's discussion later about information. Okay, so again, your attunement to your name also will be realized by the brain in some way in auditory space. Now remember the selection problem. That's what we always have to solve as agents. There are two very standard biases in science. One we call top-down. That's decision, knowledge, intention, high-level cognitive stuff. Another one is bottom-up. For our purposes, we can treat that as your name. Your name is this signal that grabs your attention. What I'm interested in learning is what are now called historical biases, biases that are based on learning and experience. Right? So I want to now turn to that. How do we become skilled attenders? How do we develop attunement? Okay. So remember, the person in the laboratory manipulates attention by using this condition that we pulled out of our common conception of attention, folk psychology and empirical psychology. If you want to become better tuners and attenders, this is also the way that you're going to do it. Specifically, just as the laboratory person gives you a task to manipulate and set your attention in the lab, you as a person, an agent, can set your attention by what? Practice. This is the mechanism by which you'll do it. So I want to give you a concrete example, which is the radiologist. The radiologist, an attending radiologist here, is looking with students here at an X-ray, chest X-ray, and pointing out some feature where she wants the students to jointly attend with her so she can impart some knowledge. And you do this over and over again in a way of acquiring the right knowledge that sets attunement so you're ready to attend. Now, chest X-rays are really quite interesting sort of images because they contain a lot of information. In this study by Donovan and Litchfield, they tasked their subjects with looking for anomalies. Right? These anomalies are quite subtle. So here's an anomaly in this chest X-ray. It's a little nodule in the top right. What's interesting is that there are other stuff. If you have no medical training, you probably took a look at the hilum, which is this medically normal structure in this context. It's the abnormal part that you want to focus on. So what they did was they asked 4 types of individuals to basically have a task, look for this abnormality. What I want you to notice is from the naive, non-medically trained individuals, first-year residents, third-year residents, and board-certified experts, these are heat maps of fixation, where they're pointing their eyes. All right, so the hot areas is where they spend a lot of time looking. You will note a big difference across the 4 categories. And what I want to suggest to you is that there's a change in attention because there's a change in training. Over time, it's quite clear who you want looking at your chest x-ray. Right? It's like an alarm signal for that expert radiologist. Radiologists, if they see it, will often find it within 1 to 2 seconds. Right? The poor person on the left here, the naive observer, is stuck looking at that very interesting spidery structure. But in this context, that's not what you want to focus on. All right? So you can see this change over time. You're acquiring the right sort of biases by training. Now, there are many different kinds of biases. There's value, there's knowledge, memory, associations. It's not an exhaustive list. These sort of overlap. But the point is that we manipulate all these things to acquire the right attunement so that we can pay attention in a better way. So this is a map of how the eye moves, or really where the eye is pointing. But in a sense, it also reflects attunement, right? Because what we're seeing here is an individual that just has it's like they're listening for their name. They're having their attention captured. Whereas on the right, that particular doctor is focused on finding abnormalities through knowledge, recognition, and understanding of what an organ should normally look like. All right, so this is an idea here. In general, this idea of attunement and readiness to attend is just present in everyday life. So there's the idea of vigilance again. So this is a picture I took in the fall when I was walking at night down near Times Square. And again, if you walk through the streets of New York, you're attuned and vigilant in ways that you've learned because of, say, dangers or things that are interesting. There's attunement in driving. You gotta love these AI pictures, and I asked for a normal scene here, but hopefully something captures your attention that's a little off, right? And why does it capture your attention? Because you have certain expectations of what should be normal when you drive, and the violation of that expectation grabs your attention. You're attuned to things because of expectations that you have. There's also a lot of discussion these days. I just want to make a quick note. There's been a lot of talk of the attention economy. There are popular books about this. I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. It does get at some truths, but I think it frames things in the wrong way. It says that attention is a good that we have to protect, that can be stolen from us, like money, that we should lock it away. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think attention is a skill, something we develop, and that the idea of attunement is not locking away or protecting attention, it is developing attention in the right way, and that takes practice, okay? So, but again, this idea of being distracted because we have become attuned to these devices and social media. And finally, I do want to return to the most beautiful case, which is attunement to art. And I want you to think about how we engage with art in different ways. Now, I'm not an art historian nor an artist, and so my approach and what I bring to the table when I look at a painting like this is different from the art historians in the room, or the historians in the room who understand, say, Dutch culture at the time, or the style of painting, and so forth. Or indeed, the difference between those who are exposed to European art versus those who are exposed to Asian art. We bring different knowledge and expectation and memories to the table to do this. Okay, so let me just conclude by reminding you of things. There's a QR code because Oxford University Press has kindly made the first 2 chapters for free available, so you could take a picture of that if you'd like. You can also email me if you don't have time, and if for some reason they've shut it down, I will send you the 2 chapters for free. But I just want to remind you of the 3 ideas here. I've given you a picture of what human agency is. I've revealed attunement as something important that we should manipulate, and in a sense, I want to leave you with a challenge. How do you become better attuned? How do you become more skillful agents by being more skillful attenders? Okay, and with that, I thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to try to take the ball from philosophy to art history. Attention and attunement are not core art history topics, but I do want to show that they should be more considered. In contrast, style and changes of style have been a core topic, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century, when art history was established as a university discipline beginning in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. Many art historians of this time considered their main tasks to be defining style and describing stylistic changes. They were quite successful, but they did not convincingly master the biggest challenge, explaining why styles changed. So I'm going to, first of all, speak a little bit about the idea of art history as a history of perception, and then go on with the question, can we use eye tracking to measure cultural differences? Heinrich Wölfflin is one of those early art historians obsessed by style. In 1915, he published The Principles of Art History, describing changes between 16th and 17th century European art as a shift of 5 principles. So, for instance, why does Rembrandt in the 17th century draws differently than Dürer in the 16th century? And Wölfflin would explain, well, in the 16th century, artists used to be linear, and in the 17th century, they would be more painterly. The idea of a and what is important is that this shift from more linear to more painterly in Wölfflin's idea was a question of change of vision. So he seems to assume that Dürer really saw the word more linear and Rembrandt would see the word more painterly. He is not getting into details, and as I said, the big problem is that art historians of this time always speak about the history of seeing, but do not explain how they mean it. This idea had been popular in Vienna from the middle of the 19th century on, among others with Alois Riegeli, and it remained popular until the 1930s. For instance, he already has been mentioned today with Walter Benjamin. The question remains whether this was meant as a change in the physiology of mankind within rather short times of history, or if the habits of seeing changed either with the whole population or with artists without involving the physiology changing. The idea died in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but came up again in the 1970s. For instance, with Michael Baxendale writing an important book in 1972, Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy, and then in 1980 about the lime wood sculptors of Renaissance Germany. It's not mine. And in the very same years, John Berger came up with a similar idea as a BBC series and a book, Ways of Seeing. In 1975, Michel Foucault used the idea of a history of seeing to define differences between modern European history. Christine Buchig-Luxmann, Take It Again, 1980. Jonathan Crary, here at Columbia, a wonderful book on the techniques of the observer, arguing that at the early 19th century there has been shifts of perception, explaining the differences in art, book of 1990, and I'm just quoting a few of many other authors that get back to this idea. Hans Belting with Florence and Baghdad, 2006, arguing that the way of seeing in the more Eastern and more Western Europe was basically different. Michael Baxendale is the one author who tried to think this idea of history of seeing probably in the most explicit way. And he coined the term I used for the title of my lecture as a period eye. What was his problem? He tried to explain why paintings or art in the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century is so fundamentally different than art in, say, Germany, Austria in the same time. And his idea was saying, well, Italian artists are so geometric because their patrons and probably themselves had a lot of geometry while being trained at school, while at the same time living in Nuremberg or Munich or Vienna, you would learn a lot of calligraphy at school, but very little geometry. So being attuned, interested for calligraphy, you would like a wealth of folds and of curls in hairs as something very artistic, whereas being more trained in understanding volumes and geometrical forms, you would be more interested in perspectival construction and geometric paintings. Baxendale did not extensively use the term of attention, but he was one of the few art historians of this generation interested in the physiology of the eye. In 1994, he even published an article where he reviewed the eye movement research of the time, and he never thought of using eye tracker himself. That would have been quite difficult in the 1990s. But since the 1990s, eye tracker have evolved significantly, and this has made it possible for me to try to use them. So just to give you an example, this is a mobile eye tracker that we use in museum studies, and this is the video that will become from this mobile eye tracker, and you see the computer-generated abstraction of what the person on the left is looking at. You see dots that represent the fixation. Those are the moments people look at something. And you see lines that represent the saccades, the eye movements that are very quick, and moments of blindness, though we are not aware of this differentiation of fixations and saccades, but that's something is ongoing all the time while you're listening at the lecture, while you're in the street, while you're in a museum. What you also notice, if I just magnify this image, is that, of course, when reading, there is a more steady movement of the eye, and the fixations tend to have a same length, and the duration of the fixation is represented by the size of the dots, whereas when looking at paintings, images in general, there is much less systematic scanning. And at the beginning, the fixations will be very short because you're quickly scanning, short fixations, long saccades, and after a while you get into details, and then the fixations are going to be longer and the saccades much shorter. When you have a very experienced reader who is quickly reading, you get something like this. So extremely systematic saccades of same length and extremely systematic fixations of same length. Now, the question is, can we use this technology to find differences between the Florentine of the 15th century and the Germans of the 15th century. Can we prove that the fact they had different courses while being at school has an influence on their way of perception? And the answer is, of course, no. There is no time machine. I'm looking for the development of a time machine, but I don't think we will ever have it. No time machine to get any Florentine of the 15th century in my lab or Viennese of the 15th century in my lab. But what we can do is to look at people in different countries with different schooling and see whether they do have different ways of perceiving art and or non-art. And what we did is some experiments with comparing Japanese students of university, non-experts, so non-artists or non-artist majors, looking at the same images with the same procedure, then students from Austria in Vienna. And we did two different experiments, and the two different experiments resulted in very similar things. So the first experiment had 50 plus 50 participants. They were looking at 4 European, 4 Japanese, and 2 abstract pictures for 2 minutes each. The second experiment had 30 and 30 participants looking at 40 different images, but just for 12 seconds each. And those images were either non-artistic photographs taken just on the street, either in Tokyo or in Vienna, Japanese artworks, European artworks, and the same photographs by the same photographers, but declared as being art photographs. What are the results? Did we find any differences between the group? The answer is yes. We had at least 3 significant differences between the 2 groups of test persons. The first difference is that Japanese seems to pay more attention to the ground and background of images, although of course the figures do take more attention for both groups. So one of the images we used is Cranach's Paradise from the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. And this is the heat map. You've already seen heat maps. That's a representation of the spots that have been most looked at, in this case in the first experiment by Hannah Brinkmann, a doctoral student of mine, and then with the same standards in defining the heat of the fixations with the Japanese. So what you see is that the Japanese pay more attention to the ground and background, although, of course, the figures attract more attention for all viewers. We were not the first to notice this kind of difference, though the first time in art viewing. And I also suppose that difference is stronger when viewing art than viewing a normal day scene. The group of Richard Nisbet had already conducted such experiments. Nisbet is a social psychologist at the University of Michigan, who, by the way, graduated from Columbia. Nisbet claims, and I quote him, that there is a causal chain running from social structure to social practice to attention and perception to cognition. And he distinguishes between the individualism of Western and the collectivism of Eastern cultures. So the idea is that Eastern cultures are collectivist and therefore more interested by the whole context, and Western cultures are more individualistic and therefore more interested by single figures. I do have some problems with this essentialist and very unspecific assumption. and it also does not explain two other results that we found and that I will now show you. The first one is that all participants made more horizontal eye movements and less verticals, but the Japanese made significantly less horizontal and more downward saccades. You see them here. And you see that this is very much more the case when they were looking at European art, Japanese art, almost no difference when looking at non-artistic photographs, and some difference when looking at almost the same photographs but that were declared as being artworks. Why is this the case? The assumption was that it is due to reading differences. Japanese can be written in horizontal direction, but traditionally and until nowadays in newspaper, you would write from the top to the bottom. So Japanese might be more used to read, to look from top to bottom than Austrians. The third result is a bit more complicated. I try to explain it, and that's the fact that Japanese and Austrians behave differently over time, and there again, especially when looking at artworks, the amplitude of the saccades is normally bigger at the beginning and then becomes shorter. But when looking, for instance, at Japanese artworks, the Japanese remain on the same length of saccades over 12 seconds, whereas the Austrian viewers have this normal shortening of the saccades. And with the fixations, it's the other way around. At the beginning, they are normally shorter, and at the beginning, they are shorter, and with the time, they become a little bit longer. So here again, there is a difference, and the difference is mainly when looking at art. So why do differences between Austrian and Japanese people mainly occur when viewing artworks? Why do Japanese people view art differently than non-art? My hypothesis is that Japanese and Austrians are attuned in different ways when viewing artworks. This is a working hypothesis, but let me explain it. I base the hypothesis on the different status pictures have in Europe and East Asia since the Renaissance. In 1435, Florence, Alberti defined a picture as a window to the world. It's a definition that is very tightly linked with the invention of perspective and became, with perspective, part of the European art tradition. For Japanese people, a picture can be calligraphy or the representation of objects and figures, or both at the same time. Japanese pictures are windows to the world just as much as also pages with an artful text, which is completely different from European pictures. People habituated to perspective look at paintings in a way that is related to looking through the window, but this seems less true when Japanese people look at art. So what I hypothesize is that they are differently attuned to looking at art. When looking at art, they expect something that might, on the one hand, represent the world, but for the Japanese, on the other hand, also is text. And therefore, the perception of art is for Japanese somehow similar to reading. I started my thoughts by discussing Michael Baxendale's suggestion that different people and or times have different cognitive styles. I now come to the hypothesis that this might be true, but is possibly even a much more specific process. Cognitive differences might be rather small when walking in a city, but stronger when looking at specific objects, such as paintings. This is due to diverse expectation of what an artwork, what a painting is. Sorry. I therefore like to take over Wayne's term of attunement as the description of cognitive expectations, and I think this is a term that can be very much used, at least in art history as well. Thank you very much, Wayne. Thank you for your attention, and I take the opportunity to thank also the co-authors of the experiments I've presented. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Let's see. Okay. My name is Jackie Gottlieb, and as David Friedman so kindly explained, I'm a neuroscientist, and my task is to bring this all together and explain the brain and how attention works in the brain. And first I have to control my slides. And I have 20 minutes to do this, so I will not give you a lot of detail, but I hope to leave you with these 4 propositions. Okay, attention, proposition number 1, which my slide is forcing me to jump into, is that attention is a family of cognitive and neural processes that have a very specific telos, or goal, and that is an epistemic goal of gathering information. Proposition number 2 is that contrary to our intuition, information does not come from the outside world. It's not signals that we get. Information comes from inside, to a large extent, from inside our brain, and it's something that answers a question or an uncertainty that we generate. Point number 3 is that our brain implements a constant cycle of uncertainty and its resolution through orienting attention. This is a cycle that is pretty much synonymous with being awake. It's a cycle that happens unconsciously all the time while we are awake, and it has a dedicated neural mechanism. And finally, uncertainty depends on previous knowledge, and this is very much will relate to the concept of attunement that both Wayne and Raphael mentioned. Okay, so let's start. So as you have gathered by now, attention is a long-standing topic in psychology. There's thousands, tens of thousands of experiments on it, and we have heard from William James that everybody knows what attention is, and I think that you can all agree to this. If I tell you, pay attention to me, you know what to do, and really a 2-year-old knows what to do if you tell them, pay attention to me. On the other hand, we have these papers in neuroscience popping up regularly, as Wayne has said. It says no one knows what attention is, and this is 2019, so this debate is very much ongoing. And the reason we have this confusion and this, especially among experimentalists, is that when you're an experimentalist and you go to study attention in a lab, immediately you have to study a specific form of attention. So you study how people pay attention to color, or to motion, or to sounds, or to touch, or to your posture, or how you, in general, you're attentive in a general sense. And so, of course, every one of these processes has very different neural signature, very different type of things you need to think about. And so this leads to this kind of frustration where people say, well, there's not a single thing of attention, it's just a million different things. And my argument that I would like to convey is that this apparent confusion is more of our failing and reflects the fact that in our field we did not spend enough time thinking about this concept of the telos, or goal of this function that we call attention, right? So let's take an example that's more familiar. Let's say that I want to study food, and let's say that I'm a scientist, and so I have to study some sort of food, and so I study so I can study an apple, or an egg, or a steak, or a peanut, or a jackfruit. And those are very different things. And so we'd say, well, many people call food different things. And so there's no such thing as food. So, it's just different things. Okay? So this is obviously a silly conclusion to reach. But the only answer to this, why food is one thing, is given by the specific purpose of food, which is that all these different things have a specific purpose of providing energy for an organism. And I think that the analogy with attention is actually very strong. We have all these different forms of attention, and they all are different in some way, but they really all have a single purpose, if you think about it, and that is to provide us information about the world. When we attend to a sound, we want to know what that sound is. When we attend to our posture, we have to be more aware of the posture, and and so on and so forth. And so attention gains, if you think about it, life is about energy and information, and attention serves the purpose of gathering the second major currency of life. Okay. So attention is something that's dedicated to gathering information, which brings up the question, what is information? And this brings us to another big misleading intuition in the field. Intuitively, you would say, and many people say this, and many scientists say this too, information are all the signals that come from outside. So sights and sounds and photons and airwaves and yada, yada, yada. It's stuff that comes from outside. It's signals. And the opposing view to that is that no, information is something that comes from inside. Okay, so that second proposition, much less intuitive, but it turns out to be a much more useful way to think about information. Why is that? So let's consider this idea of information comes from outside. Okay, so what you're seeing here is a picture, blown-up picture of a lot of grains of sand. By the definition that information comes from outside, this picture has an infinite amount of information. Okay, you could be analyzing every pixel and every hue and every detail at increasing level of precision, and you can achieve infinite precision, and this could consume your entire life, and in fact, if that's all you were doing, you would die because you'd have no energy for anything else. The point being that information coming from outside is an infinite set. Is just too large to be useful for us. And so obviously this picture is not riveting, is not capturing your attention. You get bored of it very quickly, right? So it's not information in any psychological, meaningful sense for us. The opposite idea that information comes from inside is actually very congruent with the mathematical definition of information all the way from science, from physics, as entropy or disorder. And when you apply this to neuroscience, you talk about the entropy of a belief state or stuff that we predict about the world, and that's more easily known as uncertainty. So information is a reduction of uncertainty. Right? That's the view that information is the opposite of uncertainty, it's the opposite of entropy, it's a reduction in those quantities. And that is a very powerful idea and can be applied to pretty much everything that we do. So let's just take a simple example for when you get up in the morning and you get ready to go to work, and you wonder, whether it's rainy or sunny, okay? So you can express this, if you're a mathematician, as a belief distribution. You might assign a probability to those two possibilities. And I'm very sorry about this, and if the probabilities are equal, as so, that means you have uncertainty. There's a question, is it rainy or sunny? I don't know, they're equally likely in my mind. On the other hand, if you're in a state of belief like on the right, where you either know, very sorry, you either know for sure that it is rainy on the top or that it's sunny. It doesn't really matter which one, but in both cases you have low uncertainty. And that is indeed the mathematical definition. You can have these distributions, of course, be a lot more possibilities, and they can be continuous and whatever. But a distribution that is more flat, it doesn't distinguish between the possibilities, has higher uncertainty, and one that is more peaked has lower uncertainty. And so information is any signal that allows you to transition between a state of high uncertainty to a low uncertainty. And so a signal that tells you it'll be 90% chance of rain or only 10% chance of rain, they are both information to you. Okay? So this is the mathematical definition. Now, why does this mean that information starts from inside? The reason is that this whole story starts with a question. And the question starts before you get any visual input, right? So in the morning, you get dressed and you close your eyes and you say, this is what I need to know now. This is my question. I've generated my question. Is it rainy or sunny? And only then does this signal of rain or shine become information for you. If you didn't have the question, if you were thinking about something else, that signal would just be noise and you would just absolutely ignore it. It would be a signal that might be there in the world, but it's not information for you. So information is determined by the questions, which in turn are determined by whatever need you have at that moment. Okay, information comes from inside. Okay, so now we have uncertainty and we deploy attention to reduce uncertainty. So this, it turns out, creates a continuous cycle through our behavior, which I will call the attentional jag. And a jag means sort of a stab or a pierce. And I owe this to Daniel Berline, a very smart philosopher who wrote about arousal and curiosity back in the 1960s. And the attentional jag is this cycle of having a question, deploying attention to get a signal that answers the question, and those are states of heightened arousal, and then you get the answer and the uncertainty goes down and it's a bit lower arousal, and then you move on to the next question and so on. And again, this is the cycle that goes on several times a second. Jeez, so sorry. I'm doing my best to distract the hell out of you with the slides, but I don't know why this is not happening on my computer. It's just happening here. Okay, all right. So now we can go into the brain. Okay, so I need to describe the brain in about a minute. This is a view of the cerebral cortex, is the most developed part of your brain. And as you already saw, you can start by thinking that the cerebral cortex does two things. So if we talk about the visual system, information comes from the eye and goes to the back of the brain. And there is a very large set of areas in the back of the brain which is devoted to sort of extracting, sort of representing all that visual stimuli and sort of telling you what is there, right? So that part, the back of the brain analyzes details and recognizes categories of objects, recognizes objects and categories, also semantic information, also stores memories. So this goes on in this broad part of the back of the brain, and I'll basically say that part kind of maintains an idea of what is out there. And then the front part of the brain computes what to do about it. Is this a good thing, a bad thing? Should I approach it? Should I run away? How much effort should I put into it? So that's the economic decision making. And the part that I want to talk about, which regulates the attentional jag, is the anterior cingulate cortex, is in the front of the brain, in the midline of the brain. the anterior cingulate cortex, and this is based on work that I did with collaborators and many, many decades of work before us. The anterior cingulate cortex works in conjunction with two chemical substances that I think you're probably familiar with, dopamine and norepinephrine. Those are catecholamines. They're the substances that are targeted by things like Adderall and Ritalin that treat various disorders of attention, as you know. And dopamine and dopamine and norepinephrine act in synergy. They're chemically very similar to each other, and they have related, slightly different roles. Dopamine is involved in motivation and reward, so it energizes goal-directed behavior. It allows you to say, I want things. I want things. I'm going to exert effort. I'm going to do this right now. So it generates motivation. Norepinephrine generates something that you might call arousal. So basically, after you decide to do something, you need to execute it in an efficient manner, and norepinephrine helps the neural computations be more efficient. Okay, so the way we think that this circuit works with anterior cingulate cortex and these modulators is that the anterior cingulate cortex has a monitoring role. And it basically monitors and detects times when you have uncertainty. And points of uncertainty are usually times when you perform a little less, you're a little unsure. When the ACC detects uncertainty, it sends connections to this brainstem nucleus that I'm showing here in orange, that's called the locus ceruleus. The locus ceruleus is the only nucleus that releases norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is distributed throughout the brain and increases the efficiency of various cognitive computations. Okay, so basically the ACC says, hey, pay attention, you have uncertainty, there's a little burst of norepinephrine that makes your brain work a little better. We think that norepinephrine improves various functions like memory, also learning, but here what we will look at, it also improves visual processing. So norepinephrine reaches the visual part of the brain. So here I'm showing this part here in the back of the brain. This is a neural implementation of what Wayne told you is a priority map. So that part of the brain, the parietal cortex, maintains a representation of the visual world in which it filters out like a map. You can think of it as a map of the world, but it's a very silent map. Most stimuli are blocked out because they're irrelevant, and the stimuli that are relevant or potentially relevant for a task are selectively mapped. So it's really like a map that says, okay, monitor this location and that location and that location, right? Those are a priori interesting locations to be vigilant for in this context. Okay, in this visual map, inputs related to different locations compete with each other, meaning that you have populations of neurons that represent one location and then another population that represents another location. Those two are connected through mutual inhibition. So if you have two equal locations, they're going to silence each other. But if one location is slightly preferred, it will win through a competitive mechanism. And what norepinephrine does is it enhances the competition. It makes the competition sharper so you can focus more clearly. So you can focus more narrowly. So then, for example, let's say you have uncertainty, you have a question, will it rain? The ACC triggers a little boost of norepinephrine, and then all the possible predictors compete in your mind, and you finally, you get to your phone, and let's say you look at the screen of your iPhone. There are, again, a lot of inputs competing for your attention, but this is the important one. Sorry. Okay, that's the important one, right? AccuWeather. What's going on here? Jesus. Okay, So AccuWeather is important. So then that you really focus on AccuWeather, and you get your signal, and then you resolve your uncertainty. Okay, now you've resolved your uncertainty. Your norepinephrine is lower. Then what happens? You still have that context. You may be looking at your phone, but the competition is laxer. You have more things, so your gaze is going to be more diffuse because you really don't have a pressing question. But the next question will arise, and this cycle goes on and on and on. Okay? Okay, so I hope I didn't give this away. But by the way, I'm sure that many of you looked at AccuWeather, and you put your eye right on it, and I'm sure that you saw in your field of view what was next to it. How many people remember what picture was next to AccuWeather? I'm sure it was right on your eye. How many people remember what was there? Okay, so just another illustration of the fact that information doesn't come from outside. It's not what you look at; it's what you look for that your brain is devoting its resources to. Okay. So, okay, the final question. Okay, so I have this beautiful story here about how the anterior cingulate tells you when it pops up questions and tells you how to resolve them by looking at the appropriate thing. But some of you may have noticed that I glossed over two very important questions. How does the anterior cingulate cortex know, first of all, when there is a question and what question you have at a given time point? And then also, what is a good predictor to resolve? If I how do I know AccuWeather is a good thing as opposed to, some other predictor, looking at my TV or looking outside or so on and so forth? And the answer is that this obviously has to depend on previous knowledge, okay? Including generating uncertainty. So people say, another misleading intuition that's very common is that uncertainty is the absence of knowledge. And in fact, that isn't really true, because in order to have a question about something, you have to have prior knowledge, right? If you didn't know anything about rain or anything, you wouldn't even know that that's a question, whether it's rainy or sunny. So uncertainty depends on previous knowledge. And so what is happening here is that this is where those two parts of the brain interact, right? So the frontal part of the brain has to speak with the back part of the brain, where you have all the stored knowledge of, in this case, for example, well, there could be rain. It's May in New York. The uncertainty about rain is higher than it would be in August. I could do something about rain. I could take an umbrella. And so this establishes the presence of the question and the value of resolving that question, okay? Okay, then, and also, this previous knowledge established the value of this AccuWeather as a predictor because it's something we have learned. So this is where so Wayne's idea of attunement and previous knowledge guiding our attention is very realistic. It's a high-level psychological description. And I should also say that in the field of neuroscience, we actually know very little about this interaction between previous knowledge and this regulation of uncertainty. That's really at the frontier of what we are just starting to look at how that is implemented in the brain. Okay, so these are my 4 propositions, and so maybe even shorter. Attention is a process of reducing uncertainty that is relevant to our goals, and it involves a really intricate and broad crosstalk between mechanisms of memory, arousal, and selection. So thank you very much.
Do I begin? So, okay, can you hear me? No. Abigail? What? Can you hear me? Oh, good. Now, I assume you can all hear me. Thank you so much, speakers. That was the most fascinating selection of views on memory. I was happy to see some convergence over the selection of tasks between Wayne and Jackie, even though their approaches were totally different. And I think Raphael is the real original here, because the originality comes because of his insertion of eye tracking into the matter of attention. Obviously, what we look at has much to do with what we attend to. So we need these instruments to give us some sense of what's going on as we look. So the fascinating set of talks. I think what I want to do this afternoon, I have a few comments to make, but I'm going to make them at the end if there's time. I'm sure you have many questions to ask yourselves, but before we do that, perhaps we could ask our speakers to comment on each other's papers very briefly, and then we will open the discussion to the floor. So why don't we go in the order? Wayne, do you want to summarize anything of what happened, or attack any of your fellows?
Well, maybe I'll just, you might have noticed that what I said attention is might seem to be different. Oh, sorry. I wanted some water. What I said attention is might seem different from what Jackie said. And I want to sort of attempt a bridge. And so I don't think they're that different in the sense that when you choose to do something, that poses a lot of questions. And that is to say, you have to answer a set of questions in order to figure out how to do something. So when I said that attention is selection for action, and Jackie speaks about it as selection of information, as you said at the end, it's towards answering questions relevant to a goal. So you might think that these are in conflict. I don't think they're in conflict. I don't know if you would agree, Jackie, but that's, I think, how they're connected.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Okay, so if you say attention is a form of selection, I mean, it's true, but it's not quite sufficient, because everything we do is a form of selection. But I think that, but I do agree with you, Wayne, that many of our actions are very habitual. And yes, they are selection at the level of a neuron. So for example, how am I standing up right now? My neurons make billions of decisions to contract my muscles precisely in order to make me stand up. So there are billions of selections going on there. But here's where the concept of automaticity comes in, because somehow we have made a lot of the selections that we make are so habitual and so repetitive. And if you think of it also in informational terms, that means that they are very predictable, very habitual, right? We stand up in the same way, and this is what our brain has learned. Like, you know, a little kid who learns to walk, that's not easy. That task of learning to walk is very attention demanding, because there's still a very high entropy system, and resolving that entropy or learning requires that resource that we call attention. But by the time we have learned to stand up or walk, that becomes habitual, and so it no longer uses attention. So we don't say, I'm not paying attention to how I'm standing up, right? I'm not even conscious about it. So, but that is the real distinction there. Attention is a particular form of selection that requires the resolution of uncertainty. And I think that, and there's a cost. It's a huge question in neuroscience. What exactly is the cost? Because it feels costly. We can only resolve so many uncertainties at one time. We can't do that many in parallel. And so that's really the million-dollar question. What is the cost? But it's clear that it's costly, and it's in terms of information or entropy. Yeah.
So I just want to ask one question here, which may have, many of you may be thinking of significant to me, at least it sounds to me like what is to me a significant counter-example, a big set of counter-examples. Both of you talk about selection of what you want to hear, you talk about inside rather than outside, and so on. But we are all familiar with all those exactly the opposite cases. You talk about auditory selection, but in fact, we have no selection when we hear a loud noise, when something startles us, visually as well. For me, the root of attention when you go into, shall we say, a gallery is some particularly attractive thing which gives you no option. Selection doesn't come into it. How do you fit attention into that scheme? You go into a gallery, you see something which is very striking. It compels you to look at. Your eyes are immediately directed towards it. A loud noise grabs your attention. This seems to me self-evident. And none of your cases seem to describe that form of attention, which is central to the way we learn about the world.
Do you want to start, or should I start?
Yes, it does.
What do you say?
I said, yes, it does. Just very quickly, that, as you put it, David, your attention is grabbed. And so I pose things in terms of a selection problem. The world sometimes solves a selection problem for you.
Okay.
That's the idea.
Oh, wow. I'd answer differently. My answer would be is that evolution has endowed you with certain filters. It's all a set of filters. I mean, look, things that are contrasting, things that are changing in time or in space, like if a light stands out or something that changes in time, those are high contrast things. And our biological processing systems are tuned to emphasize contrasts or changes, right? So it's in the neural architecture. And that makes perfect sense because there's limited energy to process information, and if you process redundancies, you're wasting energy. So so evolution has, and what the way I would put it is that when you hear an unexpected loud sound, evolution has, that's a question for you, and that immediately interrupts because you're just wired for it evolutionarily. You know, there is a lot of energy going on in wavelengths that you cannot hear. And that could be conveying like the most important signals in the world that you're unaware of. So evolution somehow has figured out that, well, yeah, there could be something really important there, but I can build an organism that ignores that, right? So it's not externally dictated. It's a filter that you have, and it's a question. And the reason you think that that's a given that you react to a sound is that, yes, in your brain it's given, but it's been decided on evolutionarily.
Okay, we'll return to this.
Can I
go ahead.
Can I just really quickly? I think one thing that I would like to convey is this issue of having attention pulled. I think one of our goals in acquiring expertise is to effectively make it so that the world solves these problems for you because you've learned to basically offload it so you don't have to think about it. So think of like expert musicians and athletes, doctors, what are they doing? That alarm signal that the radiologist sees, they put themselves 10,000 hours or whatever the number is of training so that that problem, is there a cancerous growth in this lung, is solved by the world because they've prepared themselves for it. So I think that's another thing. I just want to make sure that's added in as a thing for people to think about.
It's not quite solved by the world. It's solved by filters that they built through training, right? Just as some filters were given to us through evolution, your training, you're talking about slower timescales, right? About the timescales of years, but it's the same principle. Yeah.
Well, I already see hands going up, but I'm going to ask you to speak that hand back after Raphael has had a chance to make a comment briefly on the discussion.
Well, what is fascinating to me is the problem you raised. I'm trying to sleep, and my heating is talking and talking and talking, and I would like to have a filter to stop it and not to listen to it, but I have to take earplugs because otherwise the internal filter doesn't work. And on the other hand, of course, art history is a very specific application of what we discussed that is a very everyday problem. But the building of such filters does have an implication for the way we look at artworks.
All right. So I saw the gentleman, I think it was a gentleman, who had his hand up. Can you raise it back Yes, that you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you
it's
for
Mark.
the
Is it Mark?
presentations. The
it is.
very illuminating, very striking, and very clear. But I couldn't help, and obviously, you know, coming at this from a philosophical perspective or a scientific perspective, the tendency is to strip things down to a basic scenario, to make things simple. Obviously, you're aware of how complex actual decision-making is or attention is. But it did seem to me that there was a bias in all of your presentations towards a clear thinking subject, an alert subject, filters that allow us to make decisions more easily, and so forth. But that you left out all of these things in the real world which actually impede decision. Anger, for instance, emotions, inebriation, fatigue, addiction, say addiction to seeing a certain kind of image, that all of those things, it seemed to me, are part of the actual real world situation. And I don't know if your models allow for the impaired attention of normal attention seeking or attunement in the world. It really just, it was almost like a platonic subject that was alert, seeing things clearly, and so forth. And it reflected a bias towards the positive rather than these negative filters.
Thank you, Mark. I recognize the asker of the question. Do you want to respond to that, or shall we?
Sure. We need some positivity in the world right now, so maybe that's part of it. No, it's a really good point that we have stripped it down. So one of the things that, I mean, there are lots of cases that I think are also interesting. So I teach, I notice that my students, in the old days it would have been mind wandering, in the new days it's something else, but go back to the old case of mind wandering. I mean, all of you had to sit kindly for a long time listening to us, thank you very much. And I'm sure, as anyone, your mind kind of wanders and drifts. Those of you who had something that traumatic or just like emotional that happened, say yesterday, your mind gets pulled to that. And for me, that's a kind of automaticity. It's driven by your emotional state. And it is a kind of attention in that thing grabs your attention and pulls you off things that you're doing. And so I think that's absolutely part of the richness of human experience. And so I just would say that that's also part of the selection problem, in that some things that are movements in solving that problem are not things that you intend or necessarily are part of your goals, but they are certainly powerful attractors of your attention. And I think a complete view of human experience would require that, so I acknowledge that completely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I want to say that in the picture that I gave was a very quick cartoon picture of the system, but you may have noticed that it's an extraordinarily complex mechanism that's required to control your attention well and efficiently, and to gather information efficiently. And so I think that the opportunities for errors in that mechanism are enormous. So, for example, how do you know, how do you detect uncertainty? How do you know when there's a question? Well, and also there are many questions. What's the most important question to resolve at first? How do you know what is a good predictor? I mean, think about the question. So I gave you the question I gave you the example of AccuWeather. But maybe another forecast is more accurate. So think about choosing between predictors, right? How do you evaluate what's the most informative thing? Well, you have to remember, oh, I looked at this and I got that signal. And then 2, 3, 4, 5 hours later, it rained or it didn't rain. And that means that my signal was correct or was not correct. And then you have to compute, right, the predictive validity of various signals. That is a very, very difficult process, right? And so at every stage of this process, there is the opportunity for error. Also, every stage of this process has its own little goal, intrinsic goal, and intrinsic little reward. And so you come to do you value these rewards? Do you weigh them properly, and so on? And so I think that the system is very rife with the possibilities for error. So I can exploit any any apparently irrational behavior that you want. It generates several hypotheses about why it might happen related to how you paid attention.
Here we have a question in the center.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for the presentations. I wanted to ask how you think your framework of attention plays into the rising epidemic we have of anxiety and depression, and how we are unable to shift our mind from negative thoughts. How maybe internal thoughts are different from stimuli we receive from the outside world. Thank you.
Yes, so I have some speculations about this that are, yeah. I think that one thing that happens with, so maybe I should say two things. So anxiety and uncertainty, the sense of uncertainty, they're very closely related to each other, right? So we feel like uncertainty, there's, immediately, even what I'm doing now, there's a mini arousal, right? It's a form of arousal. Anxiety, and there's a famous concept of a U-shaped function, right? Like when it comes to norepinephrine or arousal, too little is bad, you fall asleep or you're terribly bored. Too much is anxiety, pathological anxiety. Just in the middle is when you want to hit the optimal spot, where you're sort of engaged and alert, but it's not too much uncertainty and not too much anxiety, right? So there's that. So that's one concept. The other thing that I wanted to say is when the fear, the fear element comes into things. I think that the effect of fear is to really narrow your focus. And I think that this goes back to a very basic decision that biological organisms make, which our most fundamental decision is approach or avoid. Is this a good thing that I want to get something from, or is this something I'm running away from? Now, if it's a good thing to get something from, we want to learn more and more about that thing, right? So we know a lot about, so it's interesting, that's even built into our molecules. So if you look at the taste molecules, the molecules in our gustatory system that taste sugars, they have higher precision, they can differentiate different kinds of sugars, and they're also, anyway, so they're higher precision, so they extract more information about the nutrients that you want to use. On the other hand, molecules that detect bitter taste are not specific. Like they don't differentiate between two bitter tastes, but they're super sensitive. So you give them like a minimum molecules, a minimum whiff of bitterness, you just get a signal, oh, it's bad, go away. But you don't learn that much about bitter substances, right? And this is a very general biological principle, and it goes all the way to fear. So when we're fearful, that's a signal, go away, but you don't want to really know why. You don't want to know the details, right? So if you're faced with a tiger in the jungle, it's like, okay, go away. I'm not really curious about that tiger, what it looks like, and so on and so forth, right? And I think that this is how anxiety works in our brain too. It focuses us on, it actually reduces curiosity, reduces learning, and just gives you this weapons focus, which is just go away from there. And that's how it works.
If I just say something quickly about that, I mean, I like to think about, so that's a very complicated set of phenomena that might work very differently, of course. But I think one thing is that it's like a pressure or bias that makes you sensitive to certain things. And in being sensitive, it can also be attractors of your attention for things. So if you're anxious about something, that's a way of making you sensitive to the thing that you're anxious about. And I think that's one way of thinking about this as just a very similar to how we engage with the world in other situations. And I think that framework gives you a kind of focal point of seeing how they can differ because the biases are different. anxiety versus decision versus knowledge and so forth. But again, it's a very complicated phenomenon, but hopefully that's like one direction of exploring it.
We have a question in front.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the...
Can you
Oh, I'm
use the
sorry.
microphone?
I'm wondering about the place of attention in terms of figure-ground relationship. I think all of this discussion has been about attention to the figure, but not context or not ground. And that's extremely significant. For example, advertising, manipulation, propaganda. I mention that because of our context, right, this year and what's happening. And so advertisers, the place of this where attention has a different context is, first they say they want you to accept taking the daily news into your home on a Sunday is safe. And then embedded in the daily news on Sunday are the editorial preferences, are the advertisements, are the acceptance in the context of the ground. And embedded within that is another form of attention, it seems to me, that's excluded so far or separate from or has a different relationship as attention. Easily manipulated, easily affecting us and our lives. I think that's a form of attention as well that needs to be deciphered and understood functionally.
I think I can try to give an answer. The first task is already to differentiate between figure and ground. And this is a limitation of uncertainty, as Jackie has tried to show. And the second point is at least taking the experiments we did comparing Austrian and Japanese students, that the Japanese students had more interest for the ground than the Austrian ones. So the one thing is to recognize the figure and then of course to be focused on it. But on the other hand, it is part of your attunement. It is part of your expectations to know whether you still are more interested to look around the figure or you're happy to just concentrate on the figure once you recognize what the figure is.
Do I see any other hands? Here on the aisle, yeah, and then on that aisle.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, thanks so much for all three talks. It's really awesome. I'm trying to bridge across them and see what my uncertainty lies in the middle. So yeah, we'll see. I think attunement can be seen a bit in relation to the posing the question, where you're ready for the information. And I totally agree with this whole intrinsic purpose. I think I want to push back a little on evolution being the answer because that seems very accidental. That doesn't come from us, what we choose to mutate, for the next generation and so forth. But my main thing I do want to put my question about has to do with the focus all three of you had on visual attention. And what about other kinds of attention? Especially because we're such abstract creatures, art is no longer just visual art. You have literature, you have, I don't know, daydreaming, and that's usually what things like really cool sci-fi fantasy stuff comes from, which I love. But yeah, I do want to ask a bit about maybe the bottom side of it is where does the question come from, and the top side of it is how can the answers be posed not just in the visual domain?
Yeah, I think that, you're absolutely right that we look at visual attention because that's what we can study most easily. The eye is just an amazing, amazing. God must have loved neuroscientists because it gave them the eye, because we have and especially the foveated eye that humans and monkeys have, so we can see, is a really good indicator to what we attend to. So we study. But I really think that this framework, I'd like to think of it, applies to all kinds of attention. Even the kind of attention that you do when you lie in the dark and don't see anything and just think about things. So the way that we think about is this principle of neurons being active, right? So you have neurons in different parts of the brain, and they're connected, and they generate spontaneous activity, and they compete with each other, right? So there's mutual inhibition, right? So the system tends to, you can't, in a small part of the brain at least, you can't have all the neurons be active. Some of them have to win, and then some other wins, and so on. So it's localized activity, right? So this is how this applies to visual stimuli, but it also applies to competition between your thoughts and between the memories that become activated or not, and so forth. And I like to think that this principle of somehow, I mean, we don't know how it happens, but this is what we should be looking for. Some mechanism that accesses your memories, generates questions, and then even if you're just working with your memory, within your memory, you look for the answer to the question, and that's what you attend to. And then you answer that question, and then you move on to the other question, and so on and so forth. And so I like to think that even our internal thoughts proceed in the same manner through questions and answers. Yeah.
Go ahead, Wayne.
One of the nice things about thought is that James pointed out that is in fact a form of attention. The philosopher Al Mealy has this nice example where he says, remember 7 animals that start with the letter G. And for all of you, probably 1 or 2 animals popped immediately to mind. You didn't have to look for them. They're just there. But now you're going to have to make a bit more effort. And I don't think your experience of locating those names, there's like, oh, you're going through a file cabinet, right? You sort of wait for the mind to pull them up. And this is the automaticity of the mind. And so I think even if you look at Yarbus's tasks, those were visual tasks, but the task was very abstractly specified. And that search space was very specific. So I want you to think of those traces as also like there's an analogous trace in the mind in terms of thought. So creativity, problem solving, you pose questions to yourself, but you don't know what the answer is. And I think this is where the automaticity of thought is really crucial, because it's exactly there that you need for the mind to give you the answer. And of course, this is where the notion of the biases matter. Your expectations, your knowledge, your experiences are going to dramatically affect what things pop up. So I think there is a really, even though we focused on the visual case, there are kind of very nice analogs there that you'll see in the cognitive case as well. And I think, again, this goes back to the richness of our experiences, that this element of attention is part of our agency, but agency, although it's often intentional, is really dependent on these automatic aspects. And you can see this very clearly in the case of thought. I think it's a very nice example.
Thank you very much. I would have a big question about attention and ornament, but instead I'd like to ask you to comment on the metaphors that we use when we talk about attention, because we pay attention. I mean, there is this whole set of economic or economy-related verbs. We pay attention, we lend attention, also in French and Italian. In German, you give attention as a tribute, man zollt Aufmerksamkeit, or you give it as a gift. And more generally, attention is reified as something that you can grab, capture, as you were saying, a commodity, it's a good. Whereas an ancient Greek or a Roman wouldn't have known what to do with that, because there isn't even a noun before late antiquity. So my question for you is, in order to understand attention, do we have to work against the linguistic structures that at least modern European languages are so, in which we are embedded?